he wrote this. He said, "Experience has taught us it is impossible to root out the evils of capitalism merely by confiscation and expropriation. For however ruthlessly such measures may be applied, astute speculators and obstinate survivors of the capitalist classes will always manage to evade them and continue to corrupt life and the life of the community. The simplest way," he said, "to exterminate the very spirit of capitalism is therefore to flood the country with notes of high face value without financial guarantees of any sort." Rough translation, Vladimir Lenin said, "The best way to destroy capitalism is to destroy the currency." We've been documenting a 10-year plan by Russia and then later China where they have purposed to de-Americanize the world. And part of what they mean by that is their plan is to remove the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. Now this has all kinds of implications. It has implications for our nation as a whole, with 23 trillion plus in debt and growing every year. It has implications for you as an individual, for where you invest, for where you save, whether or not what you own will retain its value. So what we've done is we've invited a friend into the economic war room. Actually, he's coming live from his home in Israel, Dr. Gal Luft. And he's an expert on energy, an expert on economics, and an expert on currencies. He's also the author of a new book, De-Dollarization. So I want to welcome Dr. Luft. Welcome to the economic war room.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Good to have you here. Now, I first became acquainted with you through our mutual friends, Jim Woolsey, the former CIA director, and Frank Gaffney, the head of the Centers for Security Policy. And I also quoted you in my Pentagon research back in 2008, 2009, and then again in my book, Secret Weapon, How Economic Terrorism Took Down the U.S. Stock Market and Why It Can Happen Again. So I'm so pleased to actually introduce you to the viewers of the Economic War Room.
You could be here.
You've got a new book, De-Dollarization. It talks with the subtitle is The Revolt Against the Dollar and the Rise of a New Financial Order. Other than our program here, not many people are talking about the risks that the dollar has emerging around the world. Could you explain what the reserve currency of the world is, why the dollar is a reserve currency, and why that's so important to the American people?
Well, every country has its own currency, as we know. And it is impossible for each country to trade with 180 or 190 different currencies. So what we have is something called the reserve currency, which is almost like what the English language is to people around the world. You know, we cannot speak all languages, but if everybody learns how to speak English, you can get around. So the same with the dollar. We have one currency that enjoys the trust of many, many countries and people and financial institutions, and people are willing to conduct trade and financial transactions using this currency, even if they have nothing to do with this currency. So if two African countries trade with each other, they would trade with dollars instead of using their own domestic currencies. At least that has been the case until recently. And this has served the United States for many decades. In fact, since the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, in which the dollar was officially crowned as the reserve currency of the world. And America gained a lot from this special status, but things are beginning to change. And what the book is about why things are changing and how they are going to change and how it's going to affect the American.
Sure. Now, you put a chart in your book that I've seen before. In fact, I've got a copy of it from J.P. Morgan. It shows global reserve currencies since 1450, and it makes the point that no nation's currency remains the world's reserve currency forever. So it starts in Portugal in 1450 and moves to Spain and the Netherlands and France and Britain. And as you said, since the mid-1940s, the dollar has been the primary reserve currency. That gives us a unique privilege. In fact, some have called it an exorbitant privilege. You mentioned that in the book. What benefit does it provide if we have the reserve currency here in America?
Well, first of all, we can print our own money. Let me give you an example. If Vladimir Putin wants to obtain a $100 bill, he needs to send his people to Siberia and drill 2 barrels of oil out of the ground. But if America wants to get $100, all it has to do is press print, which gives you a tremendous advantage when you are able to not only print your own money and get other countries to borrow your money. That's very important. We are, as you mentioned before, we have a deficit of a debt of $23 trillion, and it is growing at a rate of $1 trillion a year. About half of this $1 trillion is borrowed overseas, and it's borrowed against a dollar-denominated debt instrument. So this special status has given the United States the ability to borrow much more money and to run trade deficits that are bigger than any other country would be able to. And this enables us to run those kind of deficits and also to build the kind of military that we have today and to do a lot of other things, keep our military all over the world, that we would not be able to do if not for this special status. So certainly I see the dollar's status as reserve currency as the number one source of American power today. And it enables us also to impose foreign policies on the rest of the world, like in the case of Iran, North Korea, etc.
Sure, no question about that. And I want our viewers to understand how amazing this is. America represents less than about 5% of the world's population. We produce about 25% of the world's gross domestic product. But we conduct what percentage of transactions are done in dollars?
80% of trade in the world is done in US dollars.
So the influence is far beyond what any other country with 5% of the world's population would ever hope to achieve, solely because we have the reserve currency status. I think that's an important point. So how did we get here? It was the British pound prior to mid-World War II. How did we become the heir of the world's reserve currency?
Well, simply because the British Empire collapsed. Between 1944 and 1949, there was no longer a British Empire. And I think the most important thing that we need to understand about reserve currencies and the previous currencies that you described before, the reason that they lasted only about 80 to 100 years is because the empires that backed them essentially collapsed. So the dollar will remain the reserve currency as long as America retains its status and power. But if that power is called into question, or if the United States becomes so overstretched and so burdened with debt, my concern is that there'll be a migration from the dollar at the very same time that we need the rest of the world to continue to borrow, to lend us money to sustain those very, very high deficits.
Now, the dollar's come under threat before. It came under threat during the Nixon administration, and their solution was to work with the Saudis and produce what we know as the petrodollar. Can you explain how that happened?
That was one of the most brilliant moves by Henry Kissinger and Nixon. They were able to, in 1974, to persuade the Saudis to trade all their oil in US dollars. Before it was traded against gold and other currencies, but what essentially the deal was, we want you to trade all of your oil in US dollars, and in exchange we'll provide for your security. Now, if the Saudis are trading their oil in dollars, it's not only trading, it's also denominating it, it's also pricing it in dollars, and the rest of OPEC is doing the same. And very soon after that, almost all of the world's oil was traded in dollars, and almost all of the world's commodities not only oil, that's the food commodities, that's all the metals, etc., are also traded and priced in dollars. So that was a huge achievement by the Kissinger-Nixon team. Why? Because they figured out that as long as the world needs oil and the demand for oil is growing, so will the demand for dollars. And that will allow us to lend, to borrow as much money as we need, essentially. And that has been the case until recently, but as I said, now things are beginning to change.
They are beginning to change. For the Saudis in particular, the basic agreement was, you produce oil, we'll buy your oil, everything's priced in dollars, and then you'll recycle the excess dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds, which they've done, and they were large buyers of Treasury. But now we're approaching that 80-year mark at which great empires of the past have lost the reserve currency status. I mean, if it started in 1944, 2024, just a few years from now, could be that 80-year mark. We're around about that point. That makes it even more important that we find ways to protect and sustain the reserve currency.
Absolutely. And I think that what has changed, you stated correctly that it's not the first time the dollar has been under attack. But the difference is that in the past, those attacks came from all kind of tin pot dictators like Hugo Chavez and Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. These were small players. They couldn't go very far with this kind of rebellion. But now we're talking about major economic powers. We're talking about China. We're talking about the EU. We're talking about Russia. Even India is sort of looking at both sides and trying to figure out how to go about this. So through the mechanism of BRICS, I dedicated an entire chapter in the book to BRICS.
BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those are the five BRICS nations.
And there is already rumors that Turkey may join BRICS as well, and they might change the name to BRICS. But these are big countries, these are big economies, and they're developing, and they're also conducting a lot of trade with each other. So when Xi Jinping is talking to Vladimir Putin, they say, okay, we are two neighbors, we are two big economies, we trade a lot with each other. Why don't we use the dollar when we buy oil or gas from each other? Let's use our own currencies, whether it was the ruble or the renminbi, and the hell with the dollar. We don't need to use the dollar in our bilateral trade. And I think those kind of conversations are happening all over the world now.
More and more frequently. What I don't think the American people, I mean, we have this naivete. We believe that in permanence of the American system, permanence of the American dollar, that America is always going to be the world's leader. And we hope that that's the case, but it may not always be the case. If we lost the reserve currency status, how would that impact our nation, and how would that impact individuals?
The most important thing that will happen is that we will not be able to borrow so easily as we do today. That's the single most important thing that I want to leave the viewers with. Because today we almost take it on face value that we can just go and borrow and borrow and borrow, and there's always be somebody to buy our bonds. And even, I think this week, the Treasury already announced that they'll begin to sell 20-year bonds. And when you are offering 20-year bond to a country at very low interest currently, because we are at a very low interest environment in the world today, then people need to have faith in the system and faith that they will see their money back. And if you take, for example, a country like China, we borrowed from China over $1 trillion now in various bonds. Actually, it's a much higher figure if you add Hong Kong and other.
And the holdings of Fannie and Freddie Mac and what they do through through emissaries like Belgium and so forth. Yeah, it is high, no question.
I would estimate it around $1.4 trillion.
Okay.
And when we want to sustain those kind of deficits, we have to really figure out how we can get the Chinese to continue to buy our bonds at an environment when the relations are not great. So, or else we need to decide on new priorities and try to figure out how to cut those crazy deficits. Because when you run a deficit of $1 trillion a year, how many years can you sustain this?
I think that's your point. If we got cut off in borrowing, it's like a family who sees the credit limit imposed. They thought they had an unlimited credit card, and then all of a sudden American Express or Visa comes in and says, oh, no, here's your maximum. Well, our lifestyle is built on unlimited credit. Here's the other problem. We can monetize that debt, and countries have tried it. Venezuela's tried it, Zimbabwe tried it, Weimar Germany tried it. But if you continue that lifestyle without addressing the ability to find people to actually fund it, you then end up printing the money yourself, like the Federal Reserve, and monetize the debt. And the end result, if you're not the reserve currency, is pretty poor. It impacts our lifestyle. You know, you look at Venezuela and you wonder, how did they get to hyperinflation? Well, part of it is nobody wants their currency.
Exactly, and that's, I think, the risk that many of the younger viewers probably have not lived through a period of high inflation.
Right.
We've almost forgotten what high inflation looks like, but this is something that it could certainly come back. We're running today the most audacious experiment in the history of economics. That almost 12 years we've been in a near zero interest rates globally. And we have in this process inflated huge bubbles of real estate, equities, and most importantly derivatives, which is a very interesting discussion for another day, but these are in the many trillions of dollars. We don't know how it's going to play out, but what we do know is zero forever. And at some point, the cost of servicing our debt is going to be the number one expenditure of the U.S. government, and it will come at the expense of education, health, defense, etc.
No question. And if that happens, our lifestyle, the American lifestyle, is going to go down, not up. If things won't get better, they will get worse. And the problem is, it's going to happen at a time where socialism is rearing its head politically, and this is, Lenin's dream to destroy America as the currency gets debauched. So that is a serious problem. Now, you outlined some threats in your book. You talked about our debt. You also talked about the tendency to use economic sanctions as a weapon in every instance possible, which makes them less valuable the more often that you use them, and makes other nations resent the dollar's reserve currency. You talked about our adversaries and potential enemies, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, but you even talked about some of our allies in Europe and how they resent the dollar's unique status. Can you share a couple of those thoughts?
Yeah, since the book was published, actually a number of other countries were added to the list. All of a sudden we're talking about sanctions against Germany for building a pipeline to Russia. And we want to put sanctions on Egypt for buying Russian weapons, and the same thing to do to India. And one of the problems is we have more than 500 members of Congress, and each of them has his own pet project or issue that he or she cares about. So today it's Egypt, tomorrow it's Hong Kong, the next day it's Germany. And while all of these causes are good causes and they may be very important, but the cumulative impact of all of this is that sanctions have become the go-to solution in our foreign policy because we don't want to use force anymore. So the second best is sanctions. But the problem is that when you apply this too often, you are only feeding this club of countries. And by the way, it's not only countries, it's also corporations, it's banks, it's wealthy individuals, all kind of oligarchs and billionaires. So it adds up, and before you know, it's like a death by 1,000 cuts type of situation. That they're all doing their little things, but eventually you find yourself like Gulliver, tied to the ground by all these midgets.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that was exposed when we did Iranian sanctions is we got a copy of internal emails at Standard Chartered Bank, for example, that got caught violating the sanctions. And the emails said things like, "You effing Americans, who are you to tell us what to do?" So it creates a resentment, and that resentment, if it builds to a large enough group, it destroys America's respect in the world, and at that point, the sanctions won't have any value left.
Exactly. That's why we need to be a little bit more scrupulous about how we, and how often, and to what end we apply this type of tool. Because danger is when you run this same exercise over and over again, and you apply it too often. It loses. It not only doesn't have the impact, but it also backfires.
Yep. Well, your book has done a good job talking about some of the concerted efforts that have been raised to remove the dollar, or at least lessen the reserve currency status. Russia sold out of their treasury bonds and bought gold. China has slowly reduced their holdings by not rolling over. They may not dump the bonds, which wouldn't be effective for China, but they don't have to re-up. When they get paid out, they don't have to turn around and reinvest it in treasury bonds. You've talked about the SWIFT transaction system, the protocol and messaging, and how China has formed their own version, the CHIPS, CIPS. You've talked about the development of the petro yuan so that they can have their own ability to trade oil in Chinese currency. And you've talked about the Belt and Road Initiative. I appreciate that you outlined those. You did a great job on that. But you also said that it is not inevitable that we lose the reserve currency. It's hard to replace the dollar. No one yet is even close to having a currency that could replace it. Can you share on both of those?
I don't think we need to think about it in terms of one currency replacing another like we've had before. I don't see any currency today in the world that can fill the shoes of the dollar. I really don't. But what I do see is more of a currency multipolarity, in the sense that we're moving from a one currency system to a multi-currency system, which for the United States is not ideal, because it means that there'll be, even if another 5 currencies that will fight a certain market share of the dollar, the result will be that the demand for dollar will decline, which is where my concern is, that if the demand for dollar declines, that means that it's harder to sell those bonds and keep the low interest rates, etc. So all of these things are going to happen, even if there is not one currency that steps in and replaces the dollar.
Right.
I think we need to look at it as a more of a unipolar system that is being replaced by a multipolar system.
Right. But there are things we can do, and you outline them in the book, things we can do to mitigate the risks. Can you share a couple of things? You start off with reduced deficits and debts, but you also listed some other things that we as a nation could do that would lessen the impact over time.
Well, the most important thing is to understand that there is a problem, and I don't think that that has not dawned on Washington. I don't think that Washington gets it, the fact that there is even a problem. I think that the sense in Washington is a collective sense of invincibility.
You're right.
Basking in the glory of our financial hegemony, and etc. And this kind of message is not very popular at the moment, because things from the outside look great, and people look at the things like the equity markets, record high and so forth. But these are not indicators. I look at it from a macroeconomic perspective, and certainly not in the long run. In the long run, by the way, is not 100 years or 50 years. I'm talking 5 to 10 years. I think we'll see a lot of trouble.
Yep.
So what we need to do is, first of all, again, recognize the problem, tweak the bureaucracy in Washington in a way that we have a good handle of the situation, that we monitor gold movement, we monitor currency movements, and we get a good sense. We use intelligence agencies to have a better understanding of this. Incorporate more economists, and our foreign policy bureaucracy and defense bureaucracy has a lot of emphasis in geopolitics. I don't think that Washington understands geoeconomics as well as it does geopolitics. And the world today is all about geoeconomics, not so much geopolitics anymore. I also think we need to pay attention to technology because the currency world is changing with new technological developments like blockchain and the cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies. So things are changing, and the most important thing is to understand that the world is not static. You cannot just sit on your laurels and think that everything that happened the past 50 years will continue into the next 50 years. That's not how history works. You have to sort of move with the flow and adapt, and also look inward into your own behavior and decisions. And the thing I'm most concerned about is, as I said, the deficit and the debt, because I think at the end of the day, when you look at all the other currencies, look at the British Empire and the French and all the things that happened in the past 500-600 years, it's always the same story. You get overstretched and overburdened with debt, and then one day, like Hemingway said, it gets gradually and then suddenly.
Yep.
And I think that we are now at the gradual stage, but after gradually comes suddenly, and bankruptcy comes at some point if you don't pay attention.
Well, there's no question about that. And in fact, I've been in Washington, I've been in the Pentagon and the various intelligence agencies and warning about this, and there are a handful of people who do that. You've been doing that. You've got an excellent book. We've been doing that with this program and all of the contacts that we have. But there's another, Jim Rickards. His answer is, he says people ought to protect themselves and buy gold. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's not enough gold to go around if everybody wants to. The cumulative value of gold in the world is $7 trillion. That's all. So it's not a big enough asset class to satisfy humanity in its current size. I appreciate gold. I think gold is a very good store of value. It has proven itself in difficult times. But I think it was a little bit too simplistic to say everybody go and buy gold because there's not a lot of physical gold to go around, and also most of the people that buy gold, they buy gold paper gold. They buy all kinds of exchange traded funds, etc. that are not real physical gold, but various instruments that are attached to gold in various ways. So you have to be very careful what you actually buy.
Understood.
That said, I think that gold has a role to play, and I think that the next wave of currencies will probably be some sort of a combination of digital currency that is backed by a central bank, but also backed by some physical asset like gold, but not only gold. It could be other things as well.
Sure, and multi-currency strategies, investment, foreign stocks, and so forth. There are a lot of ways. But it's something we need to be paying attention to. There's no question. Now, what we do, Dr. Luft, is with every guest that we have and every program that we do, we write an economic battle plan. It's a PDF document where we quote from the program. I'd also like to put a few thoughts from your book into our battle plan. Would that be all right with you?
Absolutely, with pleasure. It would be very necessary for the elections, because I hear all the candidates are talking about how they're going to give free things to the public, free health and free education and free this and free that, and even pay people to breathe So I wonder where all this money is going to come from, and it's quite interesting to see that only 10 years ago we had a very successful Tea Party that sort of pushed the idea of fiscal conservatism, and today we moved in only 10 years to a point that deficits don't matter anymore and everything needs to be for free.
No, that's kind of crazy. I appreciate what you shared with us. Thank you for taking time from Israel to join us here in the Economic War Room. We really value you. And we need every one of us to get a copy of De-Dollarization and read it. It's an amazing book. It chronicles all of the information, the history of reserve currencies, why we could lose that status, what impact it would have on our lives, and what we ought to be doing as a nation about it. Now, we're going to capture Dr. Luff's message and put it in our economic battle plan. You can get a free copy at economicwarroom.com. Remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.